On the morning of August 4th, 1892, an unspeakable event unfolded within a humble residence at 92nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. Two individuals were brutally murdered with a small axe in broad daylight. One victim suffered 19 savage blows, the other 11. For over an hour, the killer moved through the house, undetected, observing, planning, and waiting. Despite a nationwide manhunt and one of the most sensational trials in American history, the true identity of the murderer remained elusive. What authorities uncovered in that scorching August heat would challenge all their preconceived notions about human nature, family loyalty, and the dark secrets that fester behind the respectable facades of New England homes. Before we delve deeper into the story of the Hennessy family and their Irish maid, who witnessed it all, remember to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us your location. We'd love to know where our fellow mystery enthusiasts are tuning in from tonight. But first, let me transport you back to a time when Fall River still bore the scars of industrialization, when immigrant families toiled in the shadows of Yankee wealth, and when a single morning would shatter the illusion of safety an entire community had carefully constructed. In the summer of 1892, Fall River, Massachusetts, was a city caught between two distinct eras. The old Yankee families, who had amassed their fortunes from whaling and maritime trade, now nervously observed as smoke, billowing textile mills transformed their genteel community into a harsher, more desperate place. They called it the Spindle City, a place where French, Canadian, and Irish immigrants endured 16-hour shifts in stifling factories, their children's futures measured in lost fingers and lint. The Hennessy house on 2nd Street stood as a testament to old money's stubborn resistance to change. Andrew Hennessy had acquired his wealth through traditional means, initially in coffins, an irony that would later pervade every newspaper account of the tragedy. By 1892, he owned rental properties, held directorships in mills, and commanded respect through fear rather than affection. At 70, his gaunt frame and piercing grey eyes caused grown men to stammer when paying their rent. His wife, Abby, was his second marriage, a practical union that had endured for 27 years without ever developing into genuine affection. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 64 with graying hair, always pulled back tightly enough to smooth the lines from her temples. The Irish girl who cleaned their home addressed her as "ma'am," with the cautious deference of someone keenly aware of her place in the world. That girl, Bridget O'Malley, had arrived from County Cork 3 years prior with only a cardboard suitcase and a letter of recommendation from a priest. At 25, she moved through the Hennessy house like a spectre, speaking only when addressed, her rough hands maintaining the spotless surfaces that bespoke proper Yankee breeding. She had learned to navigate the peculiar tensions between Mr. Hennessy and his daughters from his first marriage. Lizzie Hennessy, 32 and unmarried, possessed a restless intelligence that made other women uncomfortable. She devoured books, spoke her mind at church meetings, and held opinions on women's suffrage that her father deemed inappropriate. Her older sister, Emma, 41 and equally spinsterish by the day's standards, had long since retreated into a shell of bitter compliance and resignation. The sisters had never truly accepted Abby as their mother, referring to her only as Mrs. Hennessy, even after nearly 3 decades. This was not mere rudeness, it was a deliberate campaign of exclusion that had slowly poisoned the household's atmosphere. Bridget had witnessed conversations abruptly cease upon Abby's entry, observed Emma and Lizzie exchange meaningful glances, and felt the oppressive weight of secrets pressing against the walls like humidity before a storm. The summer of 1892 had been particularly stifling. Mill workers were restive, with whispers of labor organizers moving through the tenements and strikes in Lawrence and Lowell. The Hennessy family felt pressure from several directions: financial instability as textile markets fluctuated, social tension as old Fall River families were outnumbered by immigrants, and the constant friction within their own walls. In the weeks leading up to August 4th, that friction had escalated into something more perilous. Family arguments grew more frequent and vicious. Lizzie had been overheard shouting at her father about money, his will, and property she believed rightfully belonged to her and Emma. Neighbors later recalled seeing lights burning late into the night, voices raised with the kind of anger that penetrates thin walls and closed windows. Bridget attempted to remain unseen during these confrontations, But in a house of that size, privacy was an illusion. She knew Mr. Hennessy had recently altered his will, and that he had been discussing property transfers that would leave his daughters with less than they anticipated. She was aware of Emma's bitter resentment toward Abby, Lizzie's increasingly erratic behavior, and conversations that abruptly halted when she entered rooms to sweep or dust. What she didn't realize was how close they were to a breaking point that would transform their private grievances into a public nightmare. The morning of August 4th dawned thick and sultry, the kind of heat that caused clothing to cling to skin and tempers to flare without warning. Bridget rose before dawn, as always, stoking the kitchen fire and preparing breakfast for a family that rarely ate together anymore. The tension in the house had become so palpable you could taste it, metallic and bitter like blood. John Desmond, Mrs. Hennessy's brother-in-law from out of town, had arrived unexpectedly the previous night, a gaunt man with nervous hands and restless eyes. He claimed to be in Fall River on business. Still, Bridget had overheard enough whispered conversations to know his visit concerned property deals and family money. His presence added another layer of stress to an already volatile situation. At breakfast, the family gathered in the dining room for what would be their final meal together. Mr. Hennessy sat at the head of the table, reading his newspaper with the deliberate silence of a man asserting his authority. Abby served weak coffee and day-old bread, her movements subdued and careful. Desmond nervously picked at his food, occasionally glancing toward the stairs where Lizzie remained in her room. "She's been acting strange lately," Abby confided to her brother-in-law in a voice that carried just far enough for Bridget to hear from the kitchen. "Asking questions about money, about the will. Yesterday I caught her going through Andrew's papers in his study." Desmond nodded grimly. "Property disputes can tear a family apart. I've seen it happen before." When Lizzie finally appeared, her pale face was flushed with an emotion Bridget couldn't quite identify. Anger, certainly, but something else that made the Irish girl's hands tremble as she cleared the breakfast dishes. Lizzie's dark eyes swept the room with the intensity of someone meticulously cataloging everything she saw, memorizing details for future use. The family conversation was stilted, formal, laden with undercurrents Bridget only partially grasped. There was talk of property on the south side, rental income, and decisions that needed to be made. Mr. Hennessy's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing a sentence, while Abby nodded agreement to everything he said. Lizzie remained silent, but her quietness was more ominous than any argument. Around 900, Desmond announced his intention to visit relatives across town. He would return that evening, he stated, to conclude his business with Mr. Hennessy. As he gathered his coat and hat, Bridget noticed his trembling hands and how his eyes avoided direct contact with Lizzie's intense stare. 20 minutes later, Mr. Hennessy left for his morning rounds, collecting rents, inspecting properties, and conducting the business that kept his family in comfortable isolation from the struggles of working-class Fall River. He kissed Abby's cheek with perfunctory affection and reminded Bridget to wash the outside windows, a task that would occupy her for most of the morning. This left 3 women alone in the house: Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget. One of them would be dead within the hour. Bridget was wrestling with the heavy windows on the east side of the house when she heard the first scream. It was brief, abruptly cut off, but unmistakably human. She paused, brushing dripping soapy water onto the porch, and listened. Nothing. The street was quiet except for the distant rattle of a milk wagon and the typical sounds of a residential neighborhood going about its morning business. She resumed washing, but her movements were less confident now. There was something in the quality of that scream, not surprise or annoyance, but genuine terror, that made her stomach clench with primitive fear. When the second scream came, longer and more desperate, Bridget dropped her brush entirely. It was coming from inside the house, from upstairs, from the direction of the guest room, where Abby had been tidying up and making beds after Desmond's visit. The screaming stopped again, but this time the silence was worse than the sound had been. Bridget's Protestant upbringing had taught her that curiosity was a sin, but 3 years in the Hennessy household had also taught her that ignoring potential disasters could cost her job. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached the back door, listening intently. Nothing. She climbed the back stairs slowly, her footsteps muffled by the carpet runner Mrs. Hennessy had installed to keep the house quiet during Mr. Hennessy's afternoon naps. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dimly lit, shadowy in the morning light filtering through lace curtains. The guest room door was slightly ajar. Bridget softly called out, "Mrs. Hennessy, ma'am, are you all right?" No answer. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into a scene that would forever haunt her. Abby Hennessy lay face down on the floor beside the bed, her grey dress dark with blood. Her head was a ruin of bone and brain matter, crushed beyond recognition by repeated blows from something heavy and sharp. Blood had sprayed across the floral wallpaper, in patterns that looked almost decorative, if you didn't know what they were. But it was the smell that made Bridget's knees buckle metallic, sweet, overwhelmingly organic. The smell of a slaughterhouse of humanity reduced to meat. And standing in the corner of the room, still holding the small axe that had done the work, was Lizzie Hennessy. Her white shirtwaist was pristine, unstained. Her dark hair was perfectly arranged, but her eyes held an expression Bridget would later struggle to describe to investigators. Not madness exactly, but a kind of cold satisfaction, as if she had just completed a necessary but unpleasant task. She fell, Lizzie said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. Poor dear, she must have slipped. Bridget looked at the axe in Lizzie's hands, at the devastation on the floor, at the blood on the walls. She opened her mouth to scream, to run, to do something. But Lizzie's voice stopped her. "You're going to help me, Bridget, because if you don't, they'll say you did this." An Irish girl with no family, no connections, no one to speak for her. Who do you think they'll believe? The words struck Bridget like physical blows. She was 25 years old, 3,000 miles from home, alone in a country that viewed Irish immigrants as inherently criminal and morally suspect. She had witnessed what happened to Irish girls who defied their employers. They vanished into police cells or poverty or worse, and no one asked questions. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. Lizzie smiled, and in that smile, Bridget glimpsed something far more terrifying than anger or madness. This was pure, simple calculation. This was a woman who had planned not just murder, but its aftermath. "We wait," Lizzie said. "Father will be home soon, and then this will all be over." The next hour passed with the surreal quality of a fever dream. Lizzie meticulously cleaned the axe in the wash basin, her movements as precise as a surgeon's. She changed her dress, bundling the blood-stained clothing into a laundry bag she hid in the cellar. She repositioned Abby's body to make the wounds less obvious from the doorway, then closed and locked the guest room door. Bridget watched all of this in numbed silence, paralyzed by the realization that she was now complicit in whatever was unfolding. Every moment she remained silent made her more guilty, more trapped, more dependent on Lizzie's version of events. "You must understand," Lizzie said as she washed her hands with the thoroughness of Lady Macbeth, "that I had no choice. She was going to destroy everything. Take Father's money, leave Emma and me with nothing. She was poison in this house, Bridget. You've seen how she manipulated him, how she turned him against his own blood." The justification flowed from Lizzie's tongue, with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it many times. But Bridget noticed how Lizzie's hands continued to shake even after they were clean, and how her eyes constantly darted toward the locked guest room door. At 1100, they heard Mr. Hennessy's key in the front door. "Remember," Lizzie whispered, her fingers digging into Bridget's arm with surprising strength. "She went out to visit a sick friend. She received a note this morning. You saw the messenger bring it." Bridget nodded, though she had seen no messenger, no note. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but the alternative, being charged with murder in a system that already presumed Irish girls guilty of something, felt heavier. Hennessy entered the house in his usual manner, calling for Abby to help him with his coat. Receiving no answer, he settled into his favorite chair in the sitting room, still wearing his boots and summer jacket. At 70, the morning's heat had exhausted him more than usual. "Where's Mrs. Hennessy?" he asked Lizzie, who had appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild concern. "She received a note about Mrs. Churchill being ill," Lizzie replied smoothly. "She left about an hour ago, said she might not be back until this evening." Mr. Hennessy grunted his acceptance and closed his eyes. Within minutes, The regular rise and fall of his chest indicated he had fallen into the deep sleep of an elderly man on a hot day. Lizzie watched him for several long minutes, her face expressionless. Then she turned to Bridget and nodded toward the kitchen. "I'm going upstairs to rest," she announced loudly enough for her father to hear if he was still conscious. "The heat is making me feel faint." But instead of going to her room, Lizzie retrieved the axe from where she had hidden it behind the cellar door. Bridget wanted to run, to scream, to do something to stop what was about to happen. But her feet felt rooted to the kitchen floor, and her voice had utterly abandoned her. She could only watch as Lizzie quietly walked back toward the sitting room, the axe concealed in the folds of her clean dress. The first blow struck Mr. Hennessy just above the left temple as he slept. His eyes snapped open in surprise and pain, but he had no time to comprehend what was occurring. The second blow split his forehead down to the eye socket. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth blows completely obliterated the left side of his face. By the time Lizzie finished, Andrew Hennessy's head was a crater of bone and blood, and his daughter stood over him with the same cold satisfaction she had displayed upstairs. But this time she was breathing heavily. "Now we scream," she told Bridget. "We discover the body, we call for help, and we never speak of what really happened here." The performance that ensued was masterful. Lizzie's screams brought neighbors running from 3 houses away. Her sobbing collapse in the front yard convinced everyone that she was as much a victim as the deceased man in the sitting room. Even Dr. Henshaw, who had known the family for 20 years, was moved by her apparent grief. But Bridget noticed details the others missed. She observed how Lizzie's tears never quite reached her eyes. She noticed how quickly Lizzie regained her composure when she thought no one was watching. Most unsettling of all, she observed how Lizzie seemed to anticipate the questions the police would ask, as if she had prepared for this interrogation. When investigators discovered Abby's body upstairs, Lizzie's shock seemed genuine enough to deceive everyone except the Irish girl who had witnessed the truth. The official narrative immediately began to take shape. An unknown intruder had somehow entered the house, committed 2 brutal murders, and escaped unseen by anyone in the neighborhood. It was a convenient story. It allowed Fall River's respectable citizens to sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that evil originated outside their community, not festered within their own families. But Bridget knew better, and as the days passed and the investigation intensified, she began to understand that her knowledge made her dangerous to more people than just Lizzie Hennessy. The investigation that followed the murders revealed a Fall River most residents preferred to ignore, a city where Yankee respectability was a thin veneer over simmering resentments, where family loyalty was a luxury few could afford, and where the truth was often the most perilous thing of all. Detective Mallory, brought in from Boston to lead the investigation, was a methodical man who understood that domestic murders were rarely as mysterious as they initially appeared. Within 48 hours, he had identified several troubling aspects of the case that suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the Hennessy household. The lack of forced entry was the first red flag. The Hennessys were obsessive about security, keeping their doors locked even during daylight hours. Yet, there were no signs of a break-in, no indication that the killer had needed to search for victims or weapons. The timing of the murders was equally suspicious. Abby had been killed approximately 90 minutes before her husband. Yet, no one in the neighborhood had seen a stranger entering or leaving the house. For an outsider to commit both murders, they would have had to hide somewhere in the house for over an hour, a nearly impossible feat in a building where every room was in constant use. Most damning of all was the nature of the weapon. The axe belonged to the Hennessy family, kept in the cellar for splitting kindling. An intruder would have had to be extraordinarily familiar with the house's layout to locate it so quickly and quietly. However, Detective Mallory's investigation faced obstacles unrelated to evidence and everything to do with social class. Fall River's establishment was deeply uncomfortable with the possibility that one of their own might be capable of such violence. The Hennessys were pillars of the community, wealthy Protestant, respectable. To suggest that Lizzie might have murdered her parents was to question the fundamental assumptions upon which the city's social order was built. The pressure to find an external culprit was immense. Police arrested several Portuguese immigrants on flimsy pretexts, held Irish labourers for questioning without cause, and pursued leads that any sensible person could see were fabricated. The newspapers, meanwhile, depicted the murders as evidence of the growing threat posed by foreign elements in American society. Bridget found herself caught in the midst of this investigation, her testimony crucial, yet her credibility constantly challenged. As an Irish domestic servant, she occupied the lowest rung of Fall River's social hierarchy. Her account of events was met with suspicion, not because it was inconsistent, but because it came from someone whose word was considered inherently unreliable. During her initial interviews, Bridget adhered to the story Lizzie had concocted. Mrs. Hennessy had left to visit a sick friend, Mr. Hennessy had returned home for a nap, and both women had been in different parts of the house when the murders occurred. She described hearing strange noises, discovering the bodies, and summoning help, but Detective Mallory was experienced enough to recognize when witnesses were withholding information. He noticed how Bridget's hands trembled when she described finding Abby's body, how her voice dropped to a whisper when discussing Lizzie's whereabouts, how she seemed to be reciting rehearsed answers rather than recalling actual events. "There's something you're not telling me," he said during their third interview, his voice gentle but insistent. "I understand you're frightened, but if you know something that might help us catch the person who did this, you have a moral obligation to speak." Bridget met his eyes for a moment, and Detective Mallory saw something there that chilled him. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of hopeless resignation that stemmed from understanding that the truth might be more dangerous than any lie. "I've told you everything I know," she said quietly. "I wish I could help more, but I was outside washing windows when it happened. I didn't see anything." The detective didn't believe her, but he also understood he couldn't force her to reveal what she was hiding. In 1892 Massachusetts, the rights of domestic servants were minimal, especially if they were immigrants. Bridget O'Malley could be fired, blacklisted, or even deported if she made the wrong enemies. As the investigation dragged on through August and into September, the focus gradually shifted toward Lizzie herself. Her behavior in the days following the murders had struck many observers as odd, too controlled, too calculating for someone who had just lost both parents to a brutal attack. There were other troubling details. Several druggists in Fall River came forward to report that a woman matching Lizzie's description had attempted to purchase prussic acid, a deadly poison, on August 3rd, the day before the murders. The woman had claimed she needed it to clean a sealskin cape, but prussic acid had no legitimate use in garment care. More damaging still was the testimony of Alice Thornton, a family friend who had been staying with the Hennessys in the days after the murders. Mrs. Thornton reported seeing Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove on August 7th, just 3 days after the killings. When questioned, Lizzie claimed the dress had been stained with paint and was no longer wearable. But investigators who examined the stove found no evidence of paint, and the timing of the dress burning struck them as highly suspicious. In a crime where the killer would have been covered with blood, the destruction of potentially stained clothing looked less like housekeeping and more like evidence tampering. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: John Desmond, the brother-in-law who had been visiting the Hennessy house on the morning of the murders. Desmond had initially provided Lizzie with an alibi, claiming he had left the house early and seen nothing suspicious. But as public scrutiny intensified, Desmond became increasingly nervous about his involvement in events he didn't fully comprehend. During a follow-up interview in late August, he revealed a conversation he had overheard the night before the murders, a heated argument between Lizzie and her father about money and property rights. "She was angrier than I'd ever seen her," Desmond told Detective Mallory. "She said something about not letting Abby steal what belonged to her and Emma. Said she'd see them all dead before she'd let that happen." The statement was damning, but still circumstantial. What Detective Mallory needed was direct evidence linking Lizzie to the murders, or a witness willing to testify about what had truly happened in the Hennessy house that morning. He was beginning to suspect that he already had such a witness. The question was whether Bridget O'Malley would find the courage to tell the truth before it was too late. By early September, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. Detective Mallory had amassed enough circumstantial evidence to arrest Lizzie Hennessy, but he knew that circumstantial cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the defendant was a wealthy white woman with connections throughout the community. What he needed was either physical evidence definitively linking Lizzie to the murders or testimony from someone who had witnessed the crime. Since the physical evidence had been compromised by the family's cleanup efforts and the initial bungling of the crime scene, that left only one realistic option: convincing Bridget O'Malley to break her silence. The pressure on Bridget had been steadily mounting since the murders. She continued to work for the Hennessy family, now consisting only of Lizzie and Emma, but the atmosphere in the house had become suffocating. Lizzie watched her constantly, monitoring her conversations with investigators, controlling her access to information about the case. More disturbing were the subtle threats that peppered Lizzie's everyday conversation. References to what happened to Irish girls who betrayed their employers, observations about how easy it was for immigrants to simply disappear if they caused trouble, reminders that Bridget's word would never be believed against that of a respectable Yankee family. "You understand your position here, don't you?" Lizzie said one evening as Bridget prepared dinner. "You're part of this family now. What affects us affects you. If our reputation is damaged, you'll suffer the consequences." The message was clear: Bridget's survival depended on maintaining the fiction they had constructed together. But Detective Mallory was equally persistent. He made a point of interviewing Bridget regularly, always with different questions, always probing for inconsistencies in her story. He was a patient man who understood that frightened witnesses sometimes needed multiple opportunities to find their courage. During one such interview in mid-September, he tried a different approach. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, settling back in his chair with the casual air of someone making conversation. "You're young, intelligent, hardworking. You could have a good life in America if you wanted it. But you're never going to have that life if you're connected to this family." Bridget kept her eyes on her hands, folded carefully in her lap. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I think you do. I think you know exactly what happened in that house, and I think you know that keeping silent about it is going to destroy you. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Lizzie Hennessy killed her parents, didn't she? And you saw her do it." For a moment, Bridget's carefully constructed facade cracked. Detective Mallory saw the flash of truth in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breathing quickened. But then the mask slammed back into place. "No, sir," she said firmly. "I told you what happened. I was outside washing windows. I didn't see anything until I found the bodies." Detective Mallory studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if you change your mind, if you decide you want to tell me the truth, you know where to find me. And Bridget, when this comes to trial, and it will come to trial, you're going to be the key witness. The prosecution and the defense are both going to want your testimony. Think carefully about which version of events you want to be remembered for." That night, Bridget lay awake in her small room under the eaves, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her. 2 floors below, in the sitting room where Mr. Hennessy had died, the bloodstains had been scrubbed away and new furniture brought in. But she could still smell it sometimes, that metallic sweetness that had saturated the air that morning. She thought about Detective Mallory's words, about the life she might have if she found the courage to speak the truth. But she also thought about what would happen to her if she accused Lizzie and the jury didn't believe her. Irish girls who accused their betters of serious crimes had a way of ending up in institutions or worse. The decision was made for her 3 days later. Bridget was dusting the front parlor when she heard voices from Lizzie's room upstairs, Lizzie and her sister Emma speaking in the urgent whispers that indicated family business. She shouldn't have listened. She should have continued with her work and pretended not to hear. But something in their tone made her pause. "The detective is getting too close," Emma was saying. He's been asking questions about the will, about father's business dealings, and that Irish girl is weak. I can see it in her eyes. Bridget won't talk, Lizzie replied confidently. She's too frightened, and even if she did, who would believe her? The word of an Irish domestic against ours. But what if they do believe her? What if she tells them what really happened? There was a long pause, and when Lizzie spoke again, her voice carried a chill that made Bridget's blood freeze. Then we'll have to make sure she can't tell anyone anything. The conversation continued, but Bridget had heard enough. She finished her dusting with trembling hands, her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. That evening, a decision that would alter the course of the investigation was made by her. She proceeded to Detective Mullery's boarding house and requested a private conversation. "I need to tell you something," she stated, her Irish accent noticeably thicker due to her nervousness. "About what truly occurred that morning, about what I actually witnessed." Detective Mallory poured her a cup of tea and prepared to listen. Over the next 2 hours, Bridget's revelations would form the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Lizzie Hennessy, ultimately determining whether justice would prevail or if a calculating killer would go free. However, as Bridget spoke, unburdening herself of the secret that had tormented her conscience for months, neither she nor Detective Mallory realized that Lizzie Hennessy was far more cunning and ruthless than either had imagined. The game, as it turned out, was far from over. The trial begins on June 5, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The trial of Lizzie Hennessy for the murders of her father and stepmother commenced. The case had captivated the nation, with newspapers from Boston to San Francisco meticulously covering every detail of the proceedings. The courtroom was filled daily with spectators, reporters, and the curious, all eager to witness what many dubbed the trial of the century. District Attorney Harrison Knowlton, leading the prosecution, built his case methodically around Bridget O'Malley's testimony and the circumstantial evidence Detective Mallory had gathered. They depicted Lizzie as a calculating woman who had murdered her parents for financial gain, leveraging her intimate knowledge of the house and family routines to commit the perfect crime. Bridget's testimony became the emotional focal point of the prosecution's argument. Speaking in a clear, unwavering voice despite the hostile stares from the defense table, she recounted in horrifying detail what she had witnessed on the morning of August 4, 1892. "I saw Miss Lizzie standing over Mrs. Hennessy's body," she told the hushed courtroom. "She was holding the axe, and there was blood everywhere. When she saw me, she said that Mrs. Hennessy had fallen, but I could see what had truly happened." The defense strategy George Robinson, the defense attorney, a former governor of Massachusetts and one of New England's most skilled criminal lawyers, relentlessly attacked Bridget's credibility. He underscored her status as an Irish immigrant, insinuated that her testimony was driven by jealousy and class resentment, and highlighted the inconsistencies between her trial testimony and her initial statements to the police. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Robinson declared in his opening statement, "the prosecution would have you convict a respectable American woman on the word of a foreign domestic who has already admitted to lying to investigators. This is not justice. This is scapegoating of the worst kind." However, the prosecution had more than just Bridget's testimony. They presented evidence regarding Lizzie's attempt to purchase poison the day before the murders, her suspicious behavior following the killings, and the burned dress that could have concealed bloodstains. They called financial experts who testified about the inheritance motive, medical experts who described the brutal nature of the attacks, and character witnesses who painted a picture of a dysfunctional family torn apart by greed and resentment. The defense strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They argued that a respectable woman like Lizzie Hennessy was simply incapable of such brutality. Victorian gender stereotypes played to their advantage. The notion that a well-bred lady could wield an axe with enough force to shatter skulls was almost inconceivable to the all-male jury. Robinson also shrewdly exploited the anti-Irish prejudices of the era. He suggested that Bridget herself might have committed the murders, pointing out that she had been alone in the house with both victims and had access to the murder weapon. He portrayed her as a typical Irish servant, dishonest, violent, and motivated by class hatred. Consider the source of this testimony, He urged the jury, an immigrant girl with no family, no education, no moral foundation. A girl who admits she lied to police, who changed her story when it became convenient, who now seeks to destroy an innocent woman to save herself from suspicion. Lizzie's testimony. The trial extended for 3 weeks, with testimony from over 100 witnesses. The evidence presented painted a complex tableau of family dysfunction, financial disputes, and simmering resentments that had ultimately erupted into violence. But the most dramatic moment arrived when Lizzie herself took the stand in her own defense. Against her lawyer's advice, she insisted on testifying, confident in her ability to persuade the jury of her innocence. Lizzie's performance was masterful. She spoke softly, compelling the courtroom to strain to hear her words. She wept when describing her love for her parents, her voice breaking as she recounted discovering her father's body. She maintained her innocence with such conviction that even some reporters found themselves questioning her guilt. However, under cross-examination, cracks began to appear in Lizzie's facade. District Attorney Knowlton was relentless in his questioning, forcing her to account for the contradictions in her narrative, the suspicious timing of her actions, and her knowledge of details that only the killer could have known. "Miss Hennessy," Knowlton said, his voice sharp with prosecutorial precision, "you testified that you were in the barn when your father was murdered. Yet, 3 witnesses have stated that they searched the barn immediately after the body was discovered and found no evidence that anyone had been there recently. How do you explain this discrepancy?" For the first time during her testimony, Lizzie faltered. The confident mask slipped just enough for the jury to glimpse something calculating beneath. I may have been mistaken about the exact time," she said, the shock of discovering father's body. "It's difficult to remember every detail clearly. Indeed, memory can be unreliable under stress. Tell me, Miss Hennessy, do you remember attempting to purchase prussic acid from Smith's drugstore on August 3rd? "No, I do not." "You don't remember, or it didn't happen." "It didn't happen." Knowlton approached the witness stand, holding a piece of paper. "I have here a signed statement from Eli Bentz, the clerk at Smith's drugstore. He identifies you positively as the woman who attempted to purchase 10 cents worth of prussic acid on the afternoon of August 3rd. He says you became angry when he refused the sale. Are you calling Mr. Bentz a liar?" Lizzie's composure finally shattered completely. Her face flushed red, and her voice rose to an almost hysterical pitch. "How dare you question my character? I am a Christian woman, a member of this community. I could never. She stopped herself, but the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask, and what they found there was not the grieving daughter she had portrayed, but something much darker. The verdict and aftermath, the moment that sealed Lizzie's fate came when Knowlton produced the most damning piece of evidence the prosecution had uncovered. A letter Bridget had written to her sister in Ireland 3 weeks after the murders. The letter had been intercepted by postal inspectors and held as potential evidence. Miss O'Malley wrote this letter on August 25, 1892. Knowlton announced with the court's permission. "I'd like to read a portion of it aloud." The letter, written in Bridget's careful handwriting, contained details she had never shared with investigators, details that could only have come from someone who had witnessed the murders firsthand. "Dear Mary," Knowlton read, "I cannot sleep at night for the terrible thing I have seen. Miss Lizzie has told me I must never speak of it, but I fear for my soul if I do not tell someone the truth. She killed them both, Mary. I saw her do it with my own eyes. She killed the old woman first, then waited for the master to come home. When it was over, she looked at me with such cold eyes and said I would hang for it if I ever told. But I cannot live with this secret much longer." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Lizzie's supporters shouted protests while her detractors called for immediate conviction. Judge Dewey had to threaten to clear the courtroom before order was restored. But even more devastating than the letter itself was what occurred next. Defense attorney Robinson, realizing his client's case was crumbling, made a desperate move. He called for a brief recess and then requested a private conference with Lizzie and her sister Emma. What was said in that conference room was never officially recorded, but court stenographer Margaret Kellerman would later claim she overheard fragments of a heated conversation through the thin walls. According to Kellerman, Emma Hennessy finally broke under the pressure and confessed to her sister's lawyer that she had suspected Lizzie's guilt from the outset. "She's always been capable of violence when she doesn't get her way," Emma allegedly said. "Even as a child, she would hurt animals when she was angry. I tried to protect her, tried to give her alibis, but I can't watch her destroy that poor Irish girl to save herself." When the trial resumed, the defense's strategy had completely shifted. Robinson no longer argued for Lizzie's innocence. Instead, he attempted to argue for diminished capacity, suggesting that his client had been suffering from a form of temporary insanity brought on by years of emotional abuse. It was too little too late. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. But even as the verdict was read, Lizzie maintained her innocence with a conviction that was almost supernatural in its intensity. As the bailiffs approached to take her into custody, she turned to face the packed courtroom and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I am innocent of these charges," she declared, "and someday, when the truth is finally known, you will all understand the terrible mistake you have made here today." Some of those present would later claim there was something prophetic in her words, something that suggested she knew secrets that had not been revealed in court. Others simply saw the final performance of a calculating killer who had been caught at last. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in between. Lizzie Hennessy was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Massachusetts State Prison for Women in Sherborne. The sentence was considered merciful. Many had expected her to receive the death penalty for such a brutal crime, but the jury had been influenced by the gender prejudices of the era. The idea of executing a woman, even one guilty of parricide, struck them as somehow barbaric. The trial's aftermath revealed the true cost of the investigation and prosecution. Bridget O'Malley, despite her crucial testimony, found herself effectively unemployable in Fall River. The Irish community viewed her as a traitor who had betrayed her employer, while the Yankee establishment saw her as an outsider who had brought scandal to their city. Within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, she had left Massachusetts entirely, moving west to Montana, where she hoped to begin a new life far from the shadows of the Hennessy murders. Emma Hennessy suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was committed to a private sanitarium, where she would spend the remaining years of her life. The family fortune, such as it was entangled in legal proceedings for decades as various relatives and creditors fought over the estate. Detective Mallory, despite solving one of the most sensational cases of his career, found that the investigation had taken a toll on his health and his faith in human nature. He retired from police work within a year and moved to a small town in Vermont, where he spent his remaining years as a hardware store owner, rarely speaking of the case that had established his reputation. The Hennessy house at 92nd Street remained empty for several years after the murders. Local children claimed it was haunted, and indeed there were reports of strange sounds, unexplained lights, and other phenomena that deterred potential buyers. When it was finally sold in 1898, the new owners completely renovated it, tearing out walls and floors that might have contained bloodstains, painting over any evidence of the violence that had occurred there. But some stains run deeper than paint can cover. A startling revelation in 1918, 25 years after the trial, a remarkable document came to light that shed new insight on the Hennessy murders. A trunk discovered in the estate of Emma Hennessy's physician contained her private journal, written during her final years in the sanitarium. The journal entries, authenticated by handwriting experts, held a detailed confession that contradicted much of what had been established at trial. According to Emma's journal, she and Lizzie had planned their parents' murders together over several months. The motive was not solely financial, it was also deeply personal. Emma claimed that their father had been sexually abusing Lizzie for years, and that their stepmother had not only known about it, but had actively covered it up to protect her position in the family. "We had no choice," Emma wrote in an entry dated March 15, 1917. "The law would not have protected us. Society would not have believed us. We were trapped in that house with monsters, and the only way to escape was to become monsters ourselves." The journal also revealed that the sisters had initially intended to poison their parents, which explained Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid. When that plan failed, they resorted to the more primitive but reliable method of using the family axe. Most shocking of all was Emma's claim that Bridget O'Malley had not witnessed the murders at all. She had arrived on the scene after both parents were dead and had been coerced into lying about what she had seen. According to Emma, the Irish girl had been terrified into compliance by threats against her family back in Ireland. Poor Bridget, Emma wrote. We destroyed her life to save our own. She was innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I pray that someday she will forgive us for what we made her do. The revelation of Emma's journal caused a sensation in 1918, but by then most of the principal figures in the case were deceased. Lizzie had died in prison in 1910, still asserting her innocence. Bridget O'Malley had married and taken her husband's name, vanishing into the anonymity of the American West. Detective Mallory had passed away in 1915, taking his suspicions about the case to his grave. The journal raised more questions than it answered. If Emma's account was true, then the trial had resulted in a just verdict reached through false testimony. If it was false, the ramblings of a mentally ill woman trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy, then an innocent woman had been executed for crimes she didn't commit. The truth about what transpired in the Hennessy house on August 4, 1892, died with the last of the participants. But the case left an indelible mark on American legal history, raising fundamental questions about domestic violence, women's rights, and the reliability of witness testimony that resonate to this day. Bridget's final words in 1975, a reporter visiting Fall River discovered that Bridget O'Malley had indeed survived to old age, living under an assumed name in a small Montana town. She had married, raised children, and lived what appeared to be a normal life. But according to neighbors, she never spoke about her past, and she would become visibly distressed whenever anyone mentioned Fall River or the year 1892. Bridget died in 1948, taking her secrets to the grave. Her death certificate listed her cause of death as natural causes. But her pastor noted in his diary that her final words were, "I never told a single untruth at that trial. God help me, but I never told a single untruth." Whether that statement was a confession or a denial, no one could say for certain. The Hennessy murders remain officially solved, the case closed in the files of the Fall River Police Department. But for those who meticulously study the evidence, who examine the contradictions and inconsistencies that permeated the investigation, one question remains unanswered. In a case where everyone involved had reason to lie, where social prejudices warped the pursuit of justice, and where the truth was deemed less important than maintaining the illusion of social order, how can we ever truly know what happened in that sweltering house on an August morning more than a century ago? The answer, perhaps, is that we can't. And maybe that's precisely what someone intended all along. Just when we thought we'd heard it all, the horror in Fall River intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's uncover together what secrets still lie hidden in the shadows of American history. This mystery illustrates that sometimes the most terrifying monsters reside within our own families, concealed behind facades of respectability and social standing. The Hennessy murders remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it appears wearing the face of someone we trust, someone we love, someone we would never suspect. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe Lizzie was guilty, or was she a victim of circumstances and prejudice? Do you think Bridget O'Malley told the truth, or was she coerced into a lie that destroyed multiple lives? Share your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and desire more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. The shadows of the past are long, and sometimes they reach into the present in ways we never anticipate. Until next time, sleep well if you can.